Hello again. So welcome to semester 5. Before we start, let's consider our motivation, the purpose of which is to recognize and remember or recollect why we're here and what we're doing. Not just really in this talk, but also in general in our lives. And from the scope of Mahayana Buddhism, we have we developed a sense of familiarity with all beings. So all beings, we have a sense of feeling that we're all part of a family. And rather than concentrating on the arguments or the sort of frictions in the family, we concentrate on the fact that we are here together to work together and to feel responsible for each other. And develop a sense of very, very strong, deep-rooted sort of joyous, loving kindness, cherishing mind. So with that at the basis, then we develop a sense of responsibility, and as we understand and uncover the meaning of the Four Noble Truths, we begin to recognize in ourselves that the cause of our suffering is this ignorance, that allows for us to grasp onto things as being available to us to cause suffering and cause happiness. So we think essentially we need to grasp onto things, but we also want to grasp onto ourselves as being the subject of these feelings. And as we do that, then we end up with this distorted view. And when we see this clearly, then we recognize very, very clearly how the first of the Noble Truths, the truth of suffering, really works. And when we do that, we are then very quickly develop a sense of very, very deep compassion for all beings, because we see how easy it is to be driven by this ignorance. So ignorance is very valuable to us initially. When we recognize our own ignorance, which requires developing insight, then we see the depth of our ignorance. Then we are able to feel this very, very strong compassion. And on the basis of that compassion, we develop the responsibility for all beings based on insight, being able to understand. Once we've determined to work to become a Buddha in order to help benefit all of our family, all beings, we engage in the 6 perfections. And of those, the last is the perfection of insight. And so it's through destroying our own ignorance, through insight, and also the supporting concentration and the ethics practices, that we are able to cut through and destroy the seeds that keep us bound to this cyclic, destructive, toxic thought process. So that's what we're here to do today. So within that, so far we're in volume 3, and we're still in the current chapter, which is chapter 11, and we've just been discussing how the recognition of selflessness, or emptiness of this self, and self here, it means intrinsic existence or essence. So when we often hear selflessness, we think it means no I, right? No I, no Ben or whoever. But in fact, much more to the point is it's no basis for I, is no existence, intrinsic existence. So intrinsic again, and just to be repetitive, but to be clear, intrinsic means to exist on its own side, or to exist on my own side, independently or freely. So it's this aspect of intrinsic existence that we recognize within the Middle Way school as being the self that we believe to be there, or we naturally consider to be there, that we act on that behalf of, but in fact it's not there. And so what we're going to do is continue to work on the idea that Je Rinpoche started. Rinpoche started explaining how Chandrakirti, Isura, and Nagarjuna are all saying, look, we need to understand that causality, the nature of cause and effect, the way in which things are chained together, doesn't allow for this sense of intrinsic self that we feel, that we perceive naturally. And therefore, because of that, causality proves emptiness, and emptiness demonstrates causality. So Chandrakirti says in Ayadeva's 400 verses, we're not proponents of non-existence, and because we're proponents of dependent arising. Are we proponents of real things? No, because we are proponents of dependent arising. What do we propound? What do we believe in? We believe in dependent arising. What is the meaning of dependent arising? So it means the absence of intrinsic existence. It means no intrinsically existent production. It means the arising of effects whose nature is similar to a magician's illusion, a mirage, a reflection, a phantom city, an emanation, or a dream. It means emptiness and selflessness. So while he says this, one of the aspects of this is he talks about, we want to be very clear here about what he's saying when he talks about a magician's illusion and so on. So first of all, he's being very clear that when we recognize causality, how things arise from many different factors, causes and effects, then we're not going to be able to establish intrinsic existence because it doesn't have any independence. It's not available to exist independently. So we need to think very carefully about this. Rinpoche will go into more detail on this a little bit later, but the way in which something exists, like my fist from last session, or how this fist comes into existence, it looks like the fist is here. It's easy to see, and there's the fist. Here's a cup, wherever. So, these sorts of things are very easy for us to see and say, yeah, there it is, that's what it is. And we treat it as if it exists independently. Now, we know that in fact it exists in terms of causes. Ben's made a fist, or a potter's made a cup. All of these things, we know they're composite. We know they're caused. We know that they are prone to fade away or vanish, and we know that the atoms inside are moving all the time, so they're not even semi-permanent. They're continually changing, and they will always fade into nothing. We know these things that are quite intuitively, especially in the modern world. But what we don't do is behave as if we know those things. In fact, we behave as if they stand alone, they're independent, that they're not prone to change, and we expect them not to change. And we're looking for consistency, right? We're looking to see things not change. We are upset if we go to our favorite restaurant and they've changed our favorite dish. It's like, this is outrageous. How dare you change my favorite dish? So this sort of mind, it's like things need to stay the same. This sort of conservatism we have is not at all unusual, right? So, so this thing is really primarily we need to do is to think about how this is the natural course of things. Not only that, but things appear to be in this way that they're sort of on their own, but in fact they're not. And therefore, because they're not, then they're not available to us to cling on to. Why can't we cling on to them? Because they're really only very much a means of us projecting our own fantasies or our own ideas onto them in terms of the way they exist, how they exist, what their nature is, all of these things, right? So that sense of recognition of their nature is being not independent, not permanent or semi-permanent, or not prone to change, not not composite, right? Not made of lots of different pieces. These sorts of things here, we need to think about that carefully. And when we do, then there's sort of some sort of things become very clear to us. Like branding doesn't mean very much, a little bit. So those sorts of things begin to affect us. So I'm slightly talking too much. So I've had a holiday. So then this thing about saying like a magician's illusion is essentially one of the really important aspects of this is when Nagarjuna, Chandrakirti, and the middle way school talk about the way in which nature is. They always very clear to use it within a simile. They say it's not. They don't say it is a magician's illusion. It is an echo. It is an emanation. It is a magician's trick. They say it's like one, and there's a very good reason for that. Not just because clearly they're using this as a metaphor, but because they want to point out that there is a huge difference between illusory existence, things being an illusion, and appearing illusory. And what that is that things that are complete illusions are incapable of being part of our causal network, a part of a continual flow of cause and effect. So, for instance, if a magician is able to make an elephant appear in this room, just by a trick or an illusion or hypnosis, that elephant won't be able to do elephant things. It might appear to, but whenever the illusion is vanished, so are all the effects of the elephant may have made, except of course the impression that it has on our minds. But the impression really is actually the impression of an illusion rather than of the elephant itself. So therefore, one of the distinctions made, and this is what why Rinpoche is going very on about this quite a lot, is the difference between an illusion and an elephant, an illusion of an elephant and an elephant, is that elephant has causes and effects. It makes a difference in the world. It creates a whole lot of different actions, as do we, as does everything else that is here. So in that sense, we can distinguish and differentiate that which appears to be like an illusion and that which is an illusion in terms of the fact that illusions are non-causal and things like an illusion are causal. So why is it that he says it's like an illusion? Why is it like a reflection or a phantom city and so on? Phantom city, again, I said it's like a cloud castle. It's the same word been translated. So the reason why these things are used like that is because we put onto them this idea that they appear to us quite naturally to look like they exist in their own right, on their own sense. I want that. I need that. Where did it go? Somebody stole my thing, right? So all of this language is based on the idea that things exist in and of themselves as objects that can be transferred or can be bought or sold and so on. So this idea, we're very, very strongly linked to this idea that ourselves and the things around us, not just material things, everything, are somehow have this quality of existing on themselves, by themselves, intrinsically, even though we sort of know better. And that's why they are like an illusion, because they appear to be something that they're not. So the actual quality of what it is that makes them like an illusion is their nature of appearing to be self-existent, even though they are not. So then Rinpoche says, when we talk about thing, anything, there are those who who talk about things as being those things which are intrinsically existent, those things which are, and and those things which are able to perform a function, such as hold tea. Yeah. So between these, the thing for an essentialist, for somebody who has believes in intrinsic existence, is that what the thing is this intrinsic existence, the fact that the cup has this thing that makes it a cup. Whereas for the idea of things that perform functions, in other words, are able to function as a cup, belongs to the middle way school. Sorry, with I think yeah. So the point that Rinpoche is making here is Chandrakirti is saying, look, what I'm talking about when we say things don't exist is this thing that is beyond dependent arising, separate from dependent arising, the thing that exists on its side. We don't need it. We don't need it for a cup to work. And I think that, to me, is one of the great strong arguments about dependent arising, is we don't need to have this sort of something greater, the ghost in the machine that makes the cup a cup. It can, if it's got all the parts and all the causes and functions as a cup, it's a cup. Does it need to have some sort of soul of a cup to be a cup? Yeah. And why is it we see a soul of a cup? Why is it we see that? And so one of the things that Geshe used to say is one of the reasons why we see this cup is because it's a projection of how we see ourselves. So when we begin to recognize there's no soul or Atman or intrinsic self, the ben is a ben, the self being an intrinsically existent, essentially existent on my own side, rather than just a referent, then when that begins to loosen, then the way in which everything else appears also begins to loosen. We've talked about this before in the previous session. So then there are a lot of people who find the idea that when we get rid of the idea of intrinsic existence, this sort of existence on its own side, they still can't quite get around the idea that the middle way school isn't saying, is not saying nothing exists. So when we come up from this, when we initially start, we sort of imagine, we think about existent and non-existent, we sort of imagine that things are there and we can see them and we interact with them, and so they're there, and I really want that new car, or I really want to have a new Mac, or whatever it happens to be, or the latest iPhone. So these sorts of things, when they come like that, we sort of really see them as being something that we can take ownership of, like an object, and existing in their own right, and so on. So in that sort of mind, we interact with them with this grasping mind, right? I don't want to have this old iPhone. I want the new iPhone, right? So there's aversion and attraction like this. Yeah, me, I want this to make my life much happier. So this sort of thing here is shows us how we interact with these things. But if we're sort of saying, well, look, no, we're just trying to eliminate the basis of the grasping. We're not trying to say there are no iPhones. We're just trying to say the way there are no essentially existent or intrinsically existent iPhones. They don't exist in the way that we perceive them. Then this distinction is very hard initially for us to understand. And we think, no, well, what does that mean? It doesn't really exist. So we get these questions, and one of them is like, well, if we're saying there's sort of no intrinsic things, then does that mean, for instance, there's no memory no memory, and that are able to see things that exist in the past, because there's no existence either there. So And Chandrakirti responds and says, no, well, why we don't say that. We say definitely, of course, we don't eliminate dependent arisings. A memory arises on the independence of an object and so on, and therefore we recognize it as a dependent arising. And he cites Aryadeva, who says what we call memory is an unreal subject with an unreal object. So the way in which, and this is important because the way in which Aryadeva uses the word unreal here is saying, meaning not essentially existent, not intrinsically existent. So this unreal here is a way of him going into a little bit of a metaphor in terms of saying that it's not, it doesn't have this qualified existence. Yeah. And again, in terms of what I was saying earlier on, Chandrakirti comments on this and says, a past thing is not entirely non-existent because its effects can be seen. So, and we have it as an object of memory. So, in fact, one of the aspects of this is to recognize that the way in which we talk about things. Again, this is like saying my mother's passed away now, and so it's easy to say, well, my mother doesn't exist anymore. She's gone, right? She no longer exists. And yet the consequences of her existence are still present right now in terms of my understanding of the world, in terms of many of the benefits she's given me and many other people. So and many other effects that she's made on the universe, those effects are still present. So in this sense, there's a distinction to be made between the type of existent and non-existent of something that is past, but was a prior existence, and something that was never existence, such as the illusion of my mother. So, a hypnotist can make me possibly see my mother, and I can talk with her, but she's not really present. So in that sense, there's a distinction to be made. Now, I might believe that I'm seeing with the illusion. I might be hearing her voice and she might be telling me something, but in fact, in this sense, it's really just a projection on my side or on the side of the hypnotist or whoever, and they can use the appearance of her to instruct me. But who is instructing me is either my projection or the hypnotist, not my mother. So there's a difference to be made between that which is an illusion and that which is past. And this quality here is a distinction being made about an existent and a non-existent in terms of the current state regardless of the prior state. So just because they are they're not utterly non-existent in terms of the fact that we're still living with the consequences of them. This shows that the whole business of the causal flow, the way in which we imagine things coming, arising and falling, where we put the deadline for existence and non-existence on an object is a projected point, not a literal point, because everything is really flowing through in terms of different appearances. So in this sense, it's like to say, if we recognize my mother in terms of causality, in terms of the cause and the consequences, then her presence is still very active. But then we also have to recognize that she was composite, that she was transient, and that she was non-intrinsic. And so really to call that bundle of effects my mother is really falling into it, only using my mother as a linguistic concept. It doesn't mean that I can't cherish her or feel very grateful for what she's given me, but the way in which, if I want to identify clearly, is to say, well, in the end, there's this sort of there's no specific intrinsic mother, but a mother arose as a dependent arising, and then left as a dependent arising in that sort of sense. So one of these aspects here, and I think I'm trying to express more clearly, is how if we had some idea about the mother being intrinsic, actually existing in one sense, then at that point there must be a point where that mother vanishes, ceases to be, right? Otherwise, mother's still present. So at that point, then what we have is the idea of an existent continuing up to a point and then ceasing, right? So this aspect of how an essential existent entity is there and then vanishes is one of the objections made by the middle way philosophy, and by middle way school, and I think we'll go on to that soon. So yes, sorry, and I'll also mention this thing about using the word philosophy. So the translation uses philosophy, and I'm I every now and then say it when I'm reading translation, but I'm not very comfortable with it because a philosophy really does something else than what we're trying to do here. What we're trying to do here is to establish a path to enlightenment, and a philosophy is has a slightly different aspect to it. So within modern science, within modern philosophy, modern understanding, a lot of the ideas of emptiness we're talking about are absolutely accepted. But what is not necessarily accepted is how recognizing that in our moment, in our daily life, can free us. So this aspect of it, in terms of the relationship between insight into the nature of our perception and the nature of reality, can help free us from ignorance and from suffering, is not so easily recognized in philosophy. This is because the emphasis is not interested on that. They're not interested in that. So really this is a path to do with eliminating views, concrete views, in order to establish enlightenment so that we can benefit all of those that we care about, core beings. So right, we were talking about so you said we can have this idea about simple existence, right? So there's an idea primarily initially that one can say, well, things either exist or they don't exist. And then what we're saying is, well, we can actually look at the way in which what that means. We can talk about them saying, do they intrinsically exist? Do they exist on their side? Or do they merely exist? In other words, do they exist in a way that we can talk about them and relate to them and define them and engage with them, make them and destroy them and so on. So in this latter sense, there's no argument here. We're not arguing against that. It's this intrinsic nature that we're arguing. So we have to differentiate between what it means to be existent and to be intrinsically existent. And with the middle way school, the intrinsic existent is refuted. It doesn't exist, not even conventional, not even in our language. It doesn't mean anything in terms of something that we can relate to. In terms of it exists as an ignorance, right? So if we want to look at it, the idea that it exists there is an ignorance. It's not. It's a falsity. But the mere existence, this idea of this causal relationship that we use in language and we as a referent that is subject to change and so on, we're not this mere existence. We're not refuting that at all. And he says it's quite easy, especially when we start learning these, trying to learn how to develop insight, and we sort of read these things like the famous Chatuscoty, these four arguments, which sort of says neither existent nor non-existent nor both nor neither, and so it's oh yeah, okay. So when we begin to learn, we can start trying to think, oh, I'm trying to get to hand with this, get to understand this, and sort of say, well. I don't claim that things are not existent. I just say that they are not existent, right? So it's not like they're non-existent. They're just not existent. Or likewise, we say we don't claim that things exist. Actually, what we say is that they're just not non-existent, right? And there's this idea of sort of basically sort of trying to find a middle way between existence and not existence. So where it's, we're not saying it's existent, it's just saying it's not non-existent. And similarly, right, this idea here is Rinpoche says, and this is just silly. Says we've got to stop this, right? Essentially it's this idea essentially of getting caught up in a linguistic game of double negatives being something other than the positive. So what do I mean by that? So if I say this is this handkerchief is white, right? Um, and something else I have, I don't know. Okay, so this is not white. Okay, I'm not saying it's, in this case, we're not saying it's black, all right? So one of the things about saying it is that saying, recognizing that things which are not white are called not whites, right? So in terms of their color, this is white, and other things are not white, that are not white, right? Things, sorry, I start again, I'm really very confused, or being confusing. So here is a white handkerchief. There are non-white handkerchiefs, right? But all of the non-white handkerchiefs, right? All of those handkerchiefs which are not white are white, right? So we say we can talk about not white handkerchiefs, and we know that all the handkerchiefs that are not white handkerchiefs are not white. So that's easy enough, right? A red handkerchief is not white, so it belongs to not white. But anything that's not white has to be white. So because of this, the way in which our language works, and this is known as a universal limitation, it's only really to do, it's not with something objectively true, it's to do the way in our language works, is that a double negative is the same as a positive. And therefore, when we sort of say, you know, oh, well, it's not non-existent, it just means it's existent. We're not saying anything meaningful. It's not going to help us understand enlightenment or understand emptiness at all. And he says the problem is when we get caught in this is we sort of begin to think that there's a middle way. Somehow we're saying, you know, if the difference is actually there's a third type of existence. So there's existence and there's non-existence. Whereas where it's not existence and it's not non-existent, right? So there must be something in the middle. And he said this is, it will only really make sense if you think that existence and non-existence are like yellow and blue and you're looking for a third color. Yeah. But we're not doing that. And essentially a negation, a non-existence, is anything that isn't existent. So in that sense, it's like saying we can't find a third alternative, because when we look at white and not white, it's not like there's a middle way. There isn't something that's both white and not white. Okay, I mean, I know some people are going to go in and say, well, there are lots of different types of white men, but put that to one side. What we're talking really about is just a simple sense, the simple sense of this meaning, where we're looking at the idea of a binary, a polarized binary of saying existent, non-existent, like this. So it says that we're not looking at a third mode of existence for this. We're saying that there's intrinsic existence and non-intrinsic existence. There's mere existence and mere and non-mere existence, or mere non-existence. And these two things are distinct, they're separate. So we have to be clear about that. So he says, yeah, when we talk about the mode of an existence, we must be aware of the fact that we are limited to things either existing or not existing. But when we're talking about qualified, we can qualify that existence, say, intrinsic or non-intrinsic. So he says it's really important for us not to fall into the idea of thinking that 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 this is a non-binary, there's a non-polarized equivalent, that we're trying to say there's a third, sort of a third truth, or another way of looking at it. We're not. We're saying, yeah, there's existence, there's non-existent. We're recognizing intrinsic existence and non-intrinsic existence. So there's still, it's not like we're saying there's some sort of thing that's both or neither, like this. However, and he says, and let's be clear, when we're looking at margin market text, when we're looking at middle way texts, when existence is denied, when there's like saying there is no existence, this is always meaning intrinsic existence. It's not meaning mere existence. So in Nagarjuna, often he says, and likewise in the Heart Sutra and other sutras, It says there is no this, there is no that, there is no this, there is no that. It means there's no intrinsic existence of this, there's no intrinsic existence of that. So we recognize specifically, very rarely there'll be something that would say there is none of these, but generally then, and they're talking about it, is it doesn't exist at all. And normally that's done with a qualifier, which makes it clear that we're talking about a complete refutation of. So when Nagarjuna writes, to say it exists is a concept of permanence, and to say it does not exist is a view of annihilation. Hence the learned should not dwell in existence or non-existence, then this means intrinsic. The intrinsic existence is implied in this particular sentence. So Chandrakirti on this particular verse says, look, when whatever exists intrinsically is permanent because it, since it does not become non-existent. So what does that mean? So this is for me it was a little bit tricky, still sometimes tricky, right? So we was talking about my mother. As we say, if she continued to exist for so many years, so she lived for what, 80 something years, then we can say, she lived for 80 years. She persisted through that time. My mother was available. She wasn't a mother all that time, but she was available for 60 years as a mother, or 59 years as a mother. Then in that sense, it's like, okay, well, there's something in her, this intrinsic nature, that didn't change in terms of her being a mother for those years, right? So that quality, it was an existent, something within it existed there, and then it ceased to exist. So that sounds like, in a sense, they're saying, well, it does not become non-existent, and yet here it's the idea of saying, well, what happens when it ceases? So the point about this is essentially is that if something is sustaining, is not changing from moment to moment, such as the existence of a mother while being present, while being alive, then because there's no aspect about that change, there's no change in the existence nature of that, regardless of the fact that the mother's aging and so on, this quality doesn't change. This is the thing that we're refuting. Then we begin to see that it cannot end, because any change doesn't affect its state, right? So then the point is saying when it does go, or when it goes into a state of non-existence, I mean, first of all, it wasn't there in the first place, but we're imagining, if we think this, then the Chandrakirti says, if we say that my mother, who existed for so many years, it now no longer existed, then we're entering into a state of annihilation, or this idea of nihilism, that something ceases to be suddenly without cause, right? So this existence arises without cause. No, the basis of that arising is caused, but the idea, of course, within it, the idea of an intrinsic existence is that something there remains there throughout its existence. The quality that it has remains there all the while. Otherwise, it's not there. It's not present. If it was caused, then it's not independent, right? If it's not independent, then it's not intrinsic. So we know that we're looking at something to be remaining there throughout the journey, and then to have it to suddenly cease means that there's no cause or no response to that cessation, and this itself means there's a nihilistic point of view, or a nihilistic, meaning it's a sudden vanishing, an uncaused vanishing. So it's quite subtle, but Chandrakirti is saying here, if we begin to start thinking about essences or intrinsic existence as being something that's present in our things, in our fist or in our objects, then we say, okay, well, here's the fist, there's the fist, and the fist is now gone. Right? If we think, oh, the fist has ceased to be, oh, the fist is back again. Oh, fist's gone again, then this shows us that we are subject to both permanentism, thinking that there's something that remains there while the fist is present, and then when it goes, then it's ceased to be, and then we're saying, oh, it's something gone. This is when we believe there's something on this side, right? Not just our mind projecting on it. This is correct. In fact, this is what's happening, but the way we perceive it is different. We're not talking about philosophy here, I promise. We're not views. This is the way in which we experience the world. We're not trying to look at saying what philosophers have to say or anything like that. What we're saying is the way in which we perceive it is as if a fist is here. Right? It's quite easy to see, and the fist persists. Oh, it's gone, and now the fist is gone. So the way we experience it, that's all we're talking about, is how we experience it. And yet, what's actually happening is there's no fist there, and there's no fist gone, other than that arises from causes, that is projected onto us, that we've learned from language and from viewpoints, and then that we perceive. So we perceive it, and we perceive its non-existence. There's a perception, so that its existence is completely a perceptive one rather than an objective one, intrinsic one built into its side. On its side, it's not there. Right? So we're only trying to point out that we see it as if it appears here, but really it's in our mind. That's the main point, right? The way we perceive things is not as they appear to be, because we imbue this existence over here. No, it's not philosophical. It's completely experiential. We can easily do it. We just have to look and think, oh yeah, no, there's no fist. Oh, fist. You know, there's a fist there. It's persisting. It's not going away. Oh, it's gone again, right? You can do it yourself. I don't need to do this too much. But the point is, when we do that, it's like, oh, or the pile of rice and so on. All of these things show the same thing. So what we can learn from this is that the way in which things appear to be on this side is not really, is forgetting our involvement, the observer, or the observation part of it. The observer makes it sound like there's somebody here, but the observation, the consciousness, in terms of the way in which it imbues some quality onto it, this is the point. So we've got this language, and he talks about saying, you know, that when we talk about people saying or believing or thinking, which we naturally do, that there is some object here intrinsically that exists on this side, when we see that, then we can call this type of mind being having a view of permanence, believing in the continuity. And when we see it vanish and just pop into nothingness, cease to be without any cause, just cease to be, then this is an annihilation or nihilism. It's not Western nihilism. It's a specific meaning, nothingness, nothing there, right? And it's because of this that when we believe that things exist on their side, that there's the middle way school will often say, "Oh, that's permanent." So when we believe there is no causality at all, that things just vanish when the underlying substance it goes, then and we say, "Oh, it ceases to be," then this is a nihilistic point of view. And he says if we don't get that, if we still see that, and we somehow think that there is no fist at all, because we see the fist, even though we see the fist and we experience it, when we begin to think about it, we start to try to analyze it, and we end up thinking there's no fist there whatsoever, then this is a nihilistic point of view. We've missed the point. Fist is still there, it just doesn't exist on its side. So when we begin to, if we lose that aspect of it and we think, oh, the fist isn't there, then we've fallen into nihilism. Nihilism is far more dangerous than believing the fist is there. Why? Because if we don't recognize cause, if we think everything is an illusion, then we lose any sense of responsibility. The ground for responsibility is the fact that we can make a difference. if we don't believe there is anything that we can do to make a difference because everything is an illusion, then it doesn't matter what we do. So we fall into a position of non-responsibility, a non-ethical, unethical environment, unethical environment. So where there's no ethics apply anymore. It doesn't matter what we do, it makes no difference. So this point here is that it's deeply important that we don't allow ourselves to think that there's nothing there. We've got to recognize what is there, and what is there is to do with dependent arising. Otherwise, we fall into a very, very dark place, and we won't be able to help anybody. We won't be able to help ourselves, let alone all beings. So when we want to look at it in terms of saying, when we believe there is a fist there and we buy into that, then we are still caught in this grasping nature of reality. We're still grasping onto things as being there and being able to be efficacious, being able to do things to be for us to be blamed, for us to feel hurt. So we're still then stuck, caught within samsara. And while we're there, we can't help anybody be freed from that, right? We're still stuck in it. And this is the problem about permanent view. The view of permanence is we're not able to escape. And the view of nihilism is we're not even able to help anything. We go we're going to cause more trouble than good. So this is why we don't want either. Both of them have a very, very negative effect in terms of what it is we're trying to do. Now, I think in general, if you're not really interested in following the path, far better to believe in intrinsic existence, because then at least it's like, okay, you'll be buying into the normal way we see the world, but you won't go out causing huge amounts of harm because you'll feel some sort of a sense of responsibility anyway. But if you give up on everything, then it's lost, completely lost. So this is what is said, is essentially if we think that emptiness means a lack of existence or a lack of any existence at all, then we are falling. Our whole practice is completely collapsed. And Nagarjuna writes in the Precious Garland, he says, if we misunderstand this, our foolish mind, who taking pride in our supposed wisdom, will destroy ourselves by abandoning anything, and we will fall headfirst into the unrelenting hell. So he's saying that the consequences are essentially that without any moral or ethical ground, because we don't recognize the causality, causal causes and consequences, we're lost. So, and again, he says in his main text, Madhyamika Karika, Madhyamika Karika, he says, if you say that what arose before is now not existence, then this also means you've fallen into annihilation. Why? Because the idea of non-existence is a state opposite of existence, and both of these are intrinsic. Intrinsic non-existence means it had no consequences, and this is nihilistic. So my mother had consequences. What she did had, the things she did in her life made changes. Therefore, she's not fully non-existent. She's not intrinsically non-existent. This is different from saying she's dead. She's passed away. And Chandrakirti on independent on this sort of also say that we don't fall into these. We don't want to fall into these two extremes. It says if we if we don't recognize, and he looks at it on another point, which is to say, if we don't recognize that things have intrinsic existence in the first place, then we are free from the point of view of thinking about them being non-existent, because we don't establish their existence in the first place. So it's possibly more easy to understand than the point of saying they're really actually just part of a causal flow, or a sort of an interdependent flow, is the idea of saying that because we're not even asserting the essential existence in the first place, we don't have any essential non-existence for them either. However, this point, while it sounds very easy, is something that Rinpoche says not quite right. Because he says we don't need to have a view of annihilation or a nihilistic view established if having a nihilistic point of view is not established solely in dependence on us having a view of essential existence beforehand. He says if that's the case, then people who really have no belief whatsoever in any form of interdependent cause and effect, for instance, would be free, because they don't buy into the idea of essential existence or intrinsic existence in the first place. And he says we don't have we don't accept the existence of even a particle of essential or intrinsic nature, right? Because we don't have that, then this type of nihilism, which is denying denying it's impossible for us to have this idea of annihilation, because we don't see it as ending, because we don't believe it exists in the first place. So this form of nihilism is absolutely correct. But just because we have this view doesn't mean that we can establish that nihilism that does not depend upon the destruction of intrinsic existence is being refuted. So it only really eliminates the form of annihilation or nihilism that depends upon a former intrinsic existence rather than a rather than just non-causal altogether. But the other view of annihilation, nihilism, the one I was just trying to stumble over, where we say there are no causes, everything is just an illusion, everything is random, everything happens randomly, and then this is also not acceptable for ourselves as a middle way followers, because essentially we have because we assert a dependent arising. So the two things I think I need to be careful here, and possibly just to go over that a bit more clearly, is that yes, it's correct to say that we can recognize that we're free from nihilism, the nihilism that arises from believing that something that formerly existed intrinsically ceases to be, because we don't believe in the intrinsic existence in the first place, ever. We're pretty sure it's not there. So that form of nihilism isn't available to us, but it doesn't itself allow us to say we're not free from nihilism. We also need to take into account that because we assert a dependent arising, then we are free from the type of nihilism that says there are no causes at all, because dependent arising is all about causes. And this is important because there are schools of thought, this is the Travakas and these earlier Indian schools of thought, who are practitioners who sort of said, yeah, there's no cause and effect. This is all fabricated. It's an illusion. We can only really trust our experience, and who knows anything else is up for discussion. So this sort of point of view is considered to be quite destructive because it doesn't allow for us to recognize the importance of behaving correctly or doing the right thing. It doesn't provide us with the basis of understanding that we can do good things in the world, we can help. So those sorts of aspects of it are really important here. So another point of view of this is, oh, I need to finish, so maybe we'll finish this week. Another point of view is saying, well, maybe these views are that essentially these nihilists, these people who have such a view, and Madhyamaka, the middle way school people, are similar, because although we might have different reasons, we both say there's no intrinsic existence. And both of us agree, and both types of mind agree, that there's no essential existence, intrinsic existence, and also that karma and its effects, or cause and effect, and so on, also lack any essential or intrinsic existence. And the point being made again and again and again is that nihilist here is saying that an absence of intrinsic existence is an absence of existence, of any existence at all. It's utter non-existence, and likewise causality is not recognized at all. So in this sense, primarily it's just considered to be a confusion, or something completely confused. So in these point of views, it's like saying, no, there's both a certain absence, but one's a qualified absence in terms of recognizing and depending upon causality, depending upon this relationship of cause and the other, an effect, and therefore is completely different from it. Essentially, nihilists are just rejecting both existence. They are saying life is an illusion. So when we begin to see our minds going into saying, oh, everything's just an illusion, we have to be really careful to step back. We have to be very, very careful to step back and find cause. If we, in terms of our own practice, when we're thinking about this and doing this work, and it's quite complicated, we need to give ourselves time to think about it, really think carefully about it, and use concrete examples, bring it to our experience. Sometimes we might say, oh, we might lose a sense of things having any causal existence at all. And when we do that, we need to get that cause and effect back in again. So when we're working on it, we might be crossing that line a couple of times, trying to work out where the balance is. We always have to make sure that we don't fall into believing that there is only illusion, that there is only this sort of array of events which are not interlinked. Otherwise, then we're just nihilist. Certainly not Buddhist. Certainly not able to help anybody. Certainly not able to achieve enlightenment. So these sort of things are very, very important to get correct. So again, and this is just to be clear for those people, some of the views that we might develop as to what is the distinctions between a middle way school practitioner and somebody who says everything is an illusion. It's not like they say something and we do not. It doesn't say well, they say those are not existent. They say those are non-existent, and we and we say they are not existent. In other words, it's this business of language, right? We talked about earlier on. He says that while the Madhyamika, while the middle way school says that karma and actions, consequences, things lack intrinsic existence, they are still dependent arising. They still arise and fall. There's still this flow, whereas the nihilists don't say this. They say there's just illusion. So he says we have. I mean, he uses a whole thing about um, um, discussing how nihilists will use very similar languages, and it will sound very much like middle way school. But he says, don't be confused by this. There's a lack of clarity and a lack of understanding of what they're saying. And it is easy for us to think, oh, this is like same as Majimaka, and it's completely not. And this is all based on this aspect of whether or not we need to be responsible, whether or not we need to be ethical, whether or not we need to be aware of the consequences of our actions in the future. It says, within this, we look at in this way, then we can see clearly there's a very, very strong distinction here. And he says again, we've got to be very careful in terms of understanding that if we think that a cup can't be a cup, it can't act as a cup, it can't function as a cup, if we lose the ability of things to function, then we've lost the point as well. We've got to recognize that things do continue to function. They still do continue to interact. They just don't intrinsically exist. So this is all about this confusion between existence and intrinsic existence. We really do have to be clear about this. Existence on its side, right? On its side, standalone, it exists in its own way on its side, versus, which is how it appears, versus recognizing that it's just part of an interflow, and that the existence that we put on it is an imputation, is a put on by our perception, by the way we see the world. So it's this point, essentially, again, and Nagarjuna says on this, he says, people say, oh, well, if time doesn't exist and cause and effects don't exist, where this is going, right? Then what else can exist? Therefore, the middle way position is that everything doesn't exist, right? And the response yet again is no, that's not right. It's impossible for time and causes and effects to exist essentially in terms intrinsically anyway. They don't exist as you imagine them to exist. It's impossible for them. They are established as dependent designations, the way in which we designate them as this way, right? The way we perceive them. They also exist in terms of it within dependent arisings. Yeah. So again, what we need to recognize is that the way we see things is not how they are. Why that is because we imbue something as existing on its own side when it doesn't. We can see it very easily, and this is what we're working on. So the point about this, there have been two main aspects to this chapter primarily, is the bound relationship between dependent arising, cause and consequence, or actions and effects, dependent arising, and a non-intrinsic existence, the emptiness of intrinsic existence. This is one of the primary aspects of this chapter. And the second one is to recognize the distinction between existence and intrinsic existence, and recognizing the difference between the absence of existence and the absence of intrinsic existence. So we've got to get this really clear. And he says, once we get that clear, then we won't make the mistake of saying things like everything is an illusion, because, well, no, it's not. It's like an illusion. Why is it like an illusion? Because we imbue, we perceive wrongly, we perceive intrinsic existence all around us when it's not there. That's the nature of it being like an illusion. Not that it ceases to function as a cup, or it doesn't have any consequences, or it doesn't affect the world we're in. So Rinpoche says, look, he's gone into quite a lot of explanation here about this. He says, because our tendency is to slip again and again into this idea that what we're talking about is some sort of non-existent or some alternative to existence and so on. So he wants to be really very clear about what the subject is in terms of our discussion. And especially he wants to make sure that we can relate to interdependent existence in terms of dependent arising, how things arise in effect from causes and surrounding circumstances, how things arise from context, how things arise in dependence upon our designation, the way in which we perceive them, or our language determines them, how things arise as a collection of perceptions, and really how this establishes that there's nothing on their side that makes them what they are. Yeah, that doesn't stop them from being able to be what they are. Anyway, I don't know. Maybe I could have done better. Okay, so next is we're going to go next session is all about rational analysis. So this is the chapter to go to. This is where we look at how to recognize, how to use arguments to break through our perception or our experiential perception of essential existence. Yeah, so that's or intrinsic existence. So that's what we're doing next session. So that's chapter 12. But for the time being, let's try to think, despite Ben's slightly confused messaging, or to think about what's been said, try to be clear about how develop a sense of recognizing how we perceive, experientially, how we perceive things to be versus how they really are. So we can use the three seals, as suffering, impermanence, selflessness, as the basis of recognizing the nature of reality. Or we can look at the 12 interdependent links, we can learn more, and by getting a clearer idea about how it is we perceive it in a way that they're not, we then begin to unpack and recognize how we bind ourselves to samsara and to suffering. So let's work on that. And any benefit from this practice, let's hope it takes us towards our journey to benefiting all beings that we feel a strong kinship with and for whom we wish only happiness. Or as all beings, right? Okay, now let's finish off with a quick sit or slow sit.